Welcome, everybody, to the second day of Global Trade Week and to this discussion on ASEAN and Europe, sustainable business within a borderless world. My name's Simon Cox. I'm Emerging Markets Editor of The Economist, and I'd like to thank Standard Chartered for making this virtual discussion possible. Well, ASEAN, if it were a single country, would be, I believe, the fifth biggest economy in the world, and it's home to over 650 million people who we hope will continue to prosper. That's an attractive market for European business, but not just for European business. It's also attractive for China, for America. So where does Europe stand in this race for influence in this dynamic region? To discuss that and to discuss some of the other issues in dealing with the ASEAN region, I'm joined by four panelists I'd like to introduce now. Isabel Conroe, who is Head of Global Logistics and Supply Chain Operations at Roche. Kai Fair, who is Global Head for Trade and Working Capital at Standard Chartered. Christian Holzer, who is Chief Procurement Officer and Head of Supply Chain at Siemens Energy. And Satvinder Singh, who is Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community. And you can see their full bios on the site. There are a few other housekeeping items we should talk about before we begin. We'd like to encourage you to ask us questions. You can do that via the live discussion box on your screen. We'll also be putting some questions to you in the form of polling questions, where you can submit your vote again through the live discussion under the tab polls. And you can also download a report produced by Standard Chartered on this topic of borderless business, Europe, ASEAN, and the trade corridor between the two. Well, without further ado, let's begin the discussion. Satvinder, I mentioned in my opening remarks that China is growing its economic footprint around the world, and in ASEAN, America is back, both geopolitically and commercially. So where does that leave Europe? Is it in danger of being eclipsed by these other economic superpowers? Is the European Union still dear to the heart of ASEAN and its efforts at regional integration?
Thank you for that, Simon. The quick question is, of course not. I mean, Europe essentially is one of our largest trading and investment partners. In fact, when I look at the numbers this morning, almost $280 billion of trade happens with Europe. We are the second largest partner after China. And when it comes to FDI, once again, you're not doing too badly. After US and Japan, Europe is our third largest FDI partner. In fact, what I can see is this has been the case for the last 4 to 5 years. And in fact, the pandemic as a whole has affected a bit of the numbers. My secretariat gave me data for 2020, and it just showed a slight decrease in trade. It shows a projection of $226 billion for trade and a drop to $10.4 billion of FDI. So overall, I still think it's a decent number, considering the challenges, the disruptions our private sectors have undergone the last 2 years. But I think besides the trade and investment parts, I do see Europe playing such a critical partnership role, especially in ASEAN's development. And this has definitely been seen in the many cooperation activities that Europe has embarked over the last 1-2 decades in helping the modernization, the transformation of our economies and our societies in ASEAN. And I don't know where to start. I mean, even if I give you examples, everything ranging from the harnessing and the sharing of experiences, the European experiences with the ASEAN business communities in ranging areas from digital rights to artificial intelligence to cybersecurity, 5G technology rollouts, personal data protection. So the list just goes on, So clearly, even now as we speak, so much is being done by Europe for ASEAN in our fight against COVID. I just want to quickly mention the project of Team Europe, where a package of 800 million euros has been set aside for the ASEAN countries to cater for immediate health needs, strengthening of sanitation systems, and even mitigating some of the social economic damage that's been brought about by COVID. So what I can say is our partnership is highly valuable. And I clearly see Europe as one of those partners that truly supports the centrality of ASEAN. And I think the region in ASEAN truly appreciates that.
You mentioned this sort of history of cooperation between the two blocs. I mean, back before the global financial crisis, there were some ambitions, I believe, for a trade agreement, a bloc-to-bloc trade agreement between ASEAN and the European Union as a whole. And then I believe you moved to bilateral agreements, but even some of those bilateral agreements are on hold, I think, with Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines. So what are the stumbling blocks there? Why not more progress on those trade agreements?
Bottom line is, I think there's very strong will for the two regions to come together. That will is still there. I can assure you, because I've stepped into the secretariat. I speak to your ambassadors. I speak on the ASEAN ambassadors. They clearly all are committed towards wanting to ignite the negotiation again. And what I can see is that there's a huge amount of work now being done in the background in terms of draft frameworks being worked on by both sides, where they're trying to address what I call the level of ambition differences between the two regions. And again, it's not unsurmountable the way I looked at it. As we all appreciate and understand, I think there's a greater sense of understanding and appreciation that ASEAN member states and the EU are at very different levels of economic development, and our priorities are different. So I believe that the gaps are slowly but surely being managed very well by both sides. And I truly believe that negotiations are going to resume, hopefully, once this finalization of the draft frameworks have been sort of coordinated. Fingers crossed, we are aiming to have that done hopefully by 2021 or 2022. And that could then give us that start to the fresh negotiations. And if there's one thing that I think both the regulators on two sides have been guided is by the will of the private sectors on the two continents. And I must say, it's very clear when you take any surveys of business surveys of private sectors in the ASEAN or the EU, the top of their request of ask is this the ability for the regulators to prioritize that relationship, that trade agreement between ASEAN and EU. It's always right at the top. So I think the bottom line is it's truly important for both sides to re-energize, hopefully rescope our EU-ASEAN FTA agreement and take it forward.
Well, you mentioned those surveys of businesses, and we have some prominent representatives from business right here. So let's survey them. Isabel, if I could turn to you, could you talk about the role that ASEAN plays in your company's global ambitions?
Yes. So I'm Isabel Conrad. So I'm working for a global pharmaceutical company, Roche, with the headquarters in Switzerland. And the region, and especially Singapore, has been always a very important regional supply chain setup for our company. And I think in the last years also a growing market, but also a growing footprint where we are importing our products into the ASEAN regions via Singapore very often, and then distributing further. So we have relationships with logistics providers located in Singapore and then in the other countries. So I think it has always been, and it is growing also from a footprint point of view. Also from in Malaysia, for example, we have also IT, a shared service center there that is growing as well. So I think the region has been and is and will continue to develop and be very important for us as a pharmaceutical company. Also with our pharma ambition to really give access to more and more patients around the world. So I think that's very, very important for us as a pharmaceutical company.
And we were just talking a little bit about negotiations, about regulations. Are there any particular regulatory obstacles that you would like to see fixed, that are binding constraints on how quickly you can expand?
I think one important thing, and if you compare the European Union with the ASEAN Union, if I can say so, I think in Europe, from a regulation point of view, for our medical products, we have in Europe, we have the the European Union, and we have a sort of a common makeup in different languages, etc. This is what we are currently missing in the ASEAN region. So from a speed to market, we will always have to go very local to each and every regulations to get our products registered for those markets. So that's one of the differences which hinders us to be maybe as fast as we would like to be to give really the treatments and the access to our medicines to the patients in those countries.
Satvinder, could I turn back to you? Is that something that could, over time, be improved, or is it just intrinsic to the fact that ASEAN is a somewhat looser economic union?
The truth is, ASEAN is not the European Union, right? So, other than the kind of more of a custom union in terms of the flow of goods, a lot of the other value chains of international trade, whether it's people, intellectual property, or even standards, there will be differentiation, and these are 10 independent nations coming together. And I do suspect that over the years there has been greater effort of at least wanting to meet up to the global standards in terms of global multilateral agreements like the WTO. So there are efforts, for example, in the pharmaceutical space, where we are trying to at least ensure that the trade procedures and of listing and of entry of pharmaceuticals within the ASEAN countries is a standard procedure. And so that businesses are aware what's required. It's a global standard, and there are no extra inputs required by businesses when they are registering or entering into the market. So there is effort being made on the ground to do that. But definitely, I do agree that more can be done. But the bottom line is, I do feel that bringing, as I was mentioning earlier, bringing some of these trade agreements to come into force. And then you're talking about 2 regions with 37 countries involved. I mean, it's not going to be easy. But what's giving a lot of positive impetus has been our success that we have had. I'm sure you guys are aware that today we do have 2 things going well for us. In fact, we have elevated our partnership. There's a dialogue. We used to be dialogue partners, EU and the ASEAN. Now we have elevated that relationship to being strategic partners, and I'm already beginning to feel kind of the momentum, the trust forward with the change of our partnership towards being a strategic partner, because things that were difficult or took us so long. I mean, like our negotiations for the EU ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement. I mean, it's been in negotiation for 8 years, and I think finally on the June the 2nd this year, we have concluded the negotiations, and what we have is the coming together of a massive, first of its kind in the world, of a block-to-block air transport agreement that's going to truly bring connectivity and economic development to the ASEAN and the European countries in a sector that's probably most affected by COVID. So again, what I'm just sharing with you is that I think there's a will now. And even some of the most complex things that we thought we would have taken another 5 to 10 years to complete, there's a momentum now to address those issues and to find solutions and bridge the gaps. So that's positivism, definitely in the right direction.
We've started to receive some questions from the audience. Please keep them coming. I'll turn to them soon. Again, you can put those questions in the live discussion box on your screen. Before we get to the audience, Christian, could you also briefly give an overview of your business's relationship with ASEAN and perhaps how that relationship has evolved over recent years?
Siemens Energy is a leading energy technology company. And ASEAN, and if you look into all Asia Pacific, this is accounting for more than half of the global energy consumption, and still with 10% of the population lacking access to basic electricity. We do see great opportunity from securing affordable, reliable, sustainable power supply and improving energy access, particularly in the ASEAN countries as well. And at the same time, we also place a significant and growing share of our purchasing volume, speaking for procurement as a CPO, with suppliers in the region. We have a year-long partnership with many of the suppliers in the region, and we do see a change. Many suppliers are maturing, and we are willing to go into more midterm to long-term partnerships in the region.
That's interesting. I mean, one of the polling questions we'd like to put to the audience touches on this question of what role ASEAN should play for European business. Could we perhaps push that question out to the audience now? And the question is, what is ASEAN's primary source of appeal? Obviously, it has many virtues, but what is the chief virtue? Is it attractive primarily as a consumer market, as a manufacturing base for ASEAN, or as a manufacturing base for the greater world? Isabel, I understand you have some manufacturing in Singapore. Yeah. That's right. Is that for the ASEAN market in particular, or is that for global marketplace?
Yes, that's part of our global network. So we have Roche has not a very big footprint of internal manufacturing sites, but one of those manufacturing sites is in Singapore. But we are also using a lot of contract or CDMOs, contract and development manufacturing units, to sort of support and complement our internal network. But the location in Singapore is for part of the global network. Yes.
And just to repeat what I said at the beginning, if you'd like to vote on that polling question, you can do so via the live discussion under the tab polls. Linda, just coming back to you for a moment, you mentioned the difficulties of negotiations between two blocs that are so diverse, that include so many countries. But of course, ASEAN has had a big negotiating success recently with RCEP, in which it sort of harmonized and formalized its existing bilateral relationships with 6 countries. I guess 5, right? India being outstanding. But does that RCEP agreement leave European businesses at a disadvantage now?
Actually, the opposite. I think it's interesting how when most of the world last year was actually moving towards more closing of their borders, or at least there's a bit of anti-globalization sentiment taking place in the last 2 years. I think the region had worked very hard with its partners. That includes Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, and China. And again, these are not some of the most open economies in the world. We all know that. So the fact that the region had worked so hard the last anywhere between 7-8 years but then rush into making provisions and ensuring that they can give some hope to our businesses to be able to garner new markets. I think that whole momentum was extremely appreciated by the private sectors in our region. It's again, the RCEP is an ASEAN agreement with our key dialogue partners, and again, it brings together a huge FTA that's it's mind-boggling. 2.3 billion people, 30% of global GDP, in fact 28% of the world's trade, and about 20% of the world's FDI. And this is the market access that today it's going to be available not only for ASEAN businesses, but also for all our partners. So European companies like Roche sitting in Singapore, actually you're in a very nice place in order to look at your entire global value chain that you're operating out in ASEAN through Singapore, and reevaluate how you're going to venture into some possible new markets from some of our RCEP partners of China, Australia, Japan, or Korea. So to me, it's exciting. It's definitely new opportunities for Europe. And I'm telling you, the RCEP today comes with it a very, very modern way of looking at ROOs, the rules of origin. In fact, it's very, very open. It has a very minimal regional value content requirement of only 40%, which again, it brings a lot of value to European businesses that are wanting to get their products to have full access without any tariffs into all of those major markets. So to me, time for European businesses, the CEOs, the boardrooms, and the chairmanships of European companies to begin to relook at your global value chain, reassess new markets and the growth that you see in Asia, and time to evaluate what you do in ASEAN for you to be connected and for you to have full access and be globally competitive. So for me, it's a plus. The RCEP really brings huge opportunities for the European private sector.
Well, we've had some votes in on that first poll question. So in case you are in suspense, let me share the results with you now. According to our audience, 50% see ASEAN primarily as a consumer market, and then 17% see it as a manufacturing base for ASEAN itself, and 33% as a manufacturing base for the world, which I guess is testimony to ASEAN's free trade agreements with that wider universe of countries, making it quite a good location for serving the global market. Kai, you've been very patient. At Standard Chartered, obviously, you see companies in ASEAN across a variety of sectors. Have you noticed a sort of shift in supply chains towards the region, perhaps from other economic powerhouses nearby?
Yeah, sure, Simon, thanks. And I find the polling results quite interesting. I would have expected a little bit more balanced view in terms of manufacturing side vis-a-vis the consumer side. Let me just quickly add before I answer your question on the going back to the trade agreements. What I also find fascinating, how much ASEAN, Singapore, for instance, is on the forefront of agreeing new economy agreements. So I think it was just yesterday that the UK and Singapore announced negotiation on the DEA, the Digital Economic Agreement, following the DEPA agreement Singapore has signed. The digital economy is an 11 trillion economy, and we need to reflect that most of our trade agreements are signed and negotiated in the 90s. So it's certainly time to go into the digital forefront, and certainly the UK and Singapore are paving the way for us. But back to your question in terms of shift of supply chains. So what we saw in ASEAN through the pandemic was getting more resilient supply chains up and running on the back of a trend we've seen earlier. So it's in a way the China plus one question. And most of the change in supply chain by sector we saw in particular in electronics. So what used to happen in South China and China is now happening in Vietnam. Not so much from a European company perspective, but the Googles, the Intels of the world, Foxconn, all of them have moved production in the electronic space into Vietnam. So Vietnam becomes now the powerhouse of ASEAN for electronic manufacturing. And it's not about the cheap labor you have. It is also the quality you have, because what is, for instance, Samsung producing now in Vietnam? It's a flappable phone. So it's their benchmark phone they have. The Galaxy is produced here. Foxconn is producing the iPad and tablets there. And I think Vietnam is a fantastic growth story for ASEAN overall, and I think a remarkable reminder on how ASEAN is growing and shifting those supply chains.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I want to sort of do a deep dive into supply chains in a minute. Before we leave the sort of big picture, I would like to pose one question that's been submitted by our audience members, which is about sort of cultural affiliation. It says, given the closer cultural affiliation between Europe and America, is European business still disproportionately focused on America rather than towards Asia and specifically ASEAN? And then a sort of a supplement to that question, does European business basically see Asia as China? Savinda, how would you answer that question? How important are sort of underlying cultural affiliations in determining the focus of business?
Actually, when you look at when you go back to history, I mean, that's absolutely not true, right? One of the biggest corporations that we know that kind of used to have the biggest businesses in whole of Asia, the East India Company, was European, right? So the commercial partnerships and relationships of the European private sector has been in Asia for centuries, and you have always been the formidable power. America became quite important after World War II, and then only in the 1980s, where we saw most of the American big business then move into Asia. So America is actually pretty, even though it's one of the largest FDI countries now in ASEAN, but it's a newcomer. So European private sector has always been the traditional investor, the traditional big business, the multinational that brought huge amount of commercial knowledge, relationships, and access for ASEAN businesses to the rest of the world. So I contradict that, but I do want to say that increasingly you will see that there is obviously tension today between the US and China, and I do again see a very special role, a partnership between Europe and Asia and ASEAN especially, how we can actually play the middleman role in supporting the two of the largest economies in the world. So we do have a very important critical role to play. And I think, like I said, the way we are structuring ourselves with the RCEP in terms of global value chains, but even down the road, once we sit down and get our agreement, our FTA in motion and get our connection done between our two regions, I think there's a lot of harnessing of value for our private sector. There's so much more that can happen. So it has been traditionally, we've always been the most important commercial partners, and that's not going to change. Yeah.
Well, let's talk in a bit more detail about how supply chains are organized. Christian, could I come back to you? You mentioned in your opening remarks that you're sort of seeking deeper relationships with some of your suppliers in ASEAN. Could you explain some of the thinking behind that?
Sure. We are really having changed the criteria how to select suppliers, and we have the strategy to focus on the best suppliers, and we have clear criteria how to identify and select those, and we will be focusing on them, and we are looking for those suppliers globally. We are about to strengthen our supplier footprint and really balancing out the number of suppliers to ensure competition, but as well performance, supply chain resilience. And this is in the process of being built for all major regions in the world, and at the same time for the global footprint itself. So before, we, of course, had a lot of suppliers in ASEAN, and we used them mainly on cost out opportunities to get really the best price. But as I mentioned before, we see many of those suppliers having matured over the past years. And now we are really looking into selecting them as one of the strategic or really strategically selected suppliers that we want to grow business with, that we want to get into real partnerships with, and that we want to grow our business midterm to long term. And so pandemic has taught us to really not to put all eggs in one basket. And this is why we want to be resilient in every region of the world independently, and as well having second sources to be flexible if anything happens, and really to maintain supply chain resilience in total. And so with this new supply chain strategy as well, and we started to build it up already last year, this helped us a lot. We didn't have one day of material scarcity in one of our factories, even in the pandemic situation. And we are still focusing on reducing the number of suppliers, pooling more volume with those suppliers, helping the suppliers, still, of course, getting a more competitive price, but as well go into this midterm to long-term partnership, as well listening to supplier feedbacks on our products and our designs. And this is, I believe, where we could both grow the suppliers and ourselves to reduce the cost on the supplier side for us to have more competitive products, even that are powered by the knowledge and innovation of suppliers.
Savinder, I think you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I just want to add on additional comments that, it's not just the rest of the world and Asia, but I think even the Chinese conglomerates, both large and medium-sized, they all are looking out, and they are looking and exploring the region. Most of them also realize that they need to diversify. They can't put all their eggs in one basket. In China itself, they are damn competitive in China, but they realize they need to diversify, and you are beginning to see a huge amount of FDI from China into the manufacturing value chains. And by the way, it's not just in physical electronics, it's also in some of the services sectors. You see huge names in the IT companies. They all are making their forays from Jakarta to Singapore. They all, and in Kuala Lumpur, they all are setting their base and hiring huge amount of talent from the region to kind of globalize themselves. So they themselves are transforming and wanting to become more global, less Chinese. And then also naturally, when they are out of China, they are sitting in places like Singapore or the other capital markets in ASEAN. They are also able to tap on the US dollar more effectively. So again, this whole value chain transformation is not just from the rest of the world into Asia, but also within Asia, there's a huge amount of dynamic that's happening. And to me, it's only a good news for European businesses and ASEAN businesses, because now a lot of these Chinese conglomerates, they sit in ASEAN, in our jurisdictions. They play by the rule of law in our jurisdictions. So there's a greater ability for European businesses to build partnerships, joint partnerships, kind of in a safer way, in a more neutral environment. And I think that bodes well for sense of security and again, sustainability of those value chains.
Kai, did you want to add something?
Yeah, this resonates quite well with me. Speaking to many of our clients, what Supinda was just saying, and in particular was what Christian mentioned earlier, the prioritization and the resilience of supply chain. That seems to be the takeaway from the pandemic. They are clients who are speaking to us on supply chain finance who have never approached us before. Why? They need to address the prioritization and they need to address the resilience. How secure is my supply chain? How do I ensure that the chip I need for my data center is produced and goes through the supply chain safely into my data center, that not any part of the supply chain collapse from a credit perspective? And if the chip manufacturer has the chance to ship the manufactured chip to customer A or to customer B, that I, the buyer, secure priority within my supply chain. The second element in the supply chain we see is the deep tier financing. So not only financing the supplier of my client, but also the supplier of the supplier of the supplier. That is something banks are now asked to. We certainly asked to provide the whole value chain down to the initial supplier where the procurement starts. How does a multinational company secures that the buyer of the buyer has adequate financing, that the financials are intact, that no part of the supply chain collapses? That is something which we've only seen from here to there. Now it's going the whole supply chain, all around resilience and prioritization within the supply chain. That's something we see growing across all the segments, whether it's electronics or it's auto or consumer. It's the same ask.
You mentioned the variety of sectors in ASEAN, and actually our second poll question is on exactly that point. Perhaps we could push that out to the audience now. So the second poll question is, what sector is most likely to see major growth over the next 5 years? And you have 5 choices: pharmaceuticals, automotive, infrastructure, renewable energy, or e-commerce. So please do select your choice using the live discussion box under the tab polls. While we're waiting for those results to come in, and I'm sure our representative from the pharmaceutical sector is anxious to see the results, can I ask you, Isabel, also about supply chains and this question of streamlining versus diversification? What approach has Roche taken historically? What approach will it take in the future, do you think?
You know, it's a super interesting question. And I think the pandemic has sort of pushed us to maybe rethink, etc. And as I said before, from a manufacturing point of view, we have not a very big manufacturing internal footprint. We had I'm 27 years in the company, and when I joined, we had a much broader network. We had manufacturing sites local manufacturing sites around the world. But we streamlined over the last years to a global manufacturing network with the complement of our CDMOs, etc., sort of to support. And we have manufacturing sites in the US, in Europe, and also, as I said, in Asia and also in China. Now, during the pandemic, have we rethought about it since last year? No, but I think we really are now in the process from a supply chain point of view to say, shouldn't we really use these more regional setups to avoid this sort of interruptions or disruptions that could have been caused last year? Fortunately, we were able to secure with very strong business continuity plans, to avoid disruption. We were able to bring our goods from one node to the other without an interruption in our manufacturings, etc. But we also were sometimes sort of struggling to really bring our finished goods to our patients, our customers. And I think we found out very interesting solutions sometimes, collaborating with other partners, collaborating with the Swiss government and with the Swiss airline to bring products into remote countries which were not accessible last year during the pandemic. But so far, thoughts about it, but not a strategic direction to say, oh, we need to change, etc. And also a change in the pharmaceutical industry with the whole regulations, etc. It's also not so easy to do, but it's definitely forced us to think about what's right, etc. And I know I don't think there's black and white. There might be something in the middle. I agree with the resilience part. So what is resiliency? We are working a lot on mode of transportation. We are flying a lot of our products, or most of our products, to destinations. Couldn't we use a little more sea freight? And we have started, for example, to Asia to have some sea freight shipments and then distributing towards the region, also from a sustainability point of view and the carbon emission point of view. So nothing concrete now, but definitely thoughts in the supply chain setups, yes. And I agree with this really end-to-end supply chain setups with the partners, with the tier suppliers, etc., and really going until the patient, which is not in the rush, but really reaching our patient as rapid, as efficient, and as robust as we can.
Kai, can I ask you a question about the sort of timeline, the timing here? My editors always ask me, how has the pandemic changed the global supply chain? When will we actually know the answer to that question? How long does it take for these changes to sort of filter through? Given that you see clients across a range of sectors, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because the answer is this takes much longer than people anticipate. So the changes I talked earlier about, the Googles, the Foxcons of the world moving their supply chain and the manufacturing from South China to Vietnam, that is something which has happened way before the pandemic has hit us. It may get accelerated, but the decisions were made much earlier on. So how much the supply chain due to the pandemic has changed, we will only learn over the next couple of years to come. So I think in an even better position to explain this to us is the team from Roche and Siemens here, who can tell us how complicated it is to actually move businesses. When I ask our client, are you considering moving supply chain? The answer is yes. Are they executing against it right now? The answer is no. This takes a lot of planning to get the logistics right, to do the due diligence Christian has talked about. So I see this as a 2 to 3 year process. Depends a little bit on the complexity of your industry.
Christian, I think you wanted to add something to this discussion, and also I had a question for you. A number of you have mentioned the danger of putting all your eggs in one basket. You also noted that danger and spoke of the need for diversification. But at the same time, you're talking about reducing the number of suppliers, building tighter, deeper relationships with suppliers. Aren't those two objectives in tension with each other? Aren't deeper relationships necessarily fewer and therefore less diversified?
It's all about building really a balanced footprint with the right number of suppliers to ensure competition and supply chain resilience at the same time. So, and as well, being a bigger customer at one supplier makes me a preferred customer at the supplier in times of scarcity as well. And this makes my supply chain even more resilient. So the answer is yes and yes. I'm looking for a diversified supplier footprint, but as well for a reduced number and more focused. And this is why I'm focusing on the best suppliers. And like Kai and Isabel both mentioned before, we need to have the full understanding of the end-to-end supply chain. So whether we make sure of all the tier suppliers have the right financing, or as well are following our expectations on sustainability, on human rights, on environmental safety, health, on money laundering, on everything we expect from our end here from the European Union. We have strong regulations on supply chain law, and we need to ensure this not only with our direct suppliers, but as well with the suppliers upstream. And this is what we now need and are looking for those suppliers who can ensure this in their own supply chain. And furthermore, all of this plus looking into sustainability in the sense of reducing their carbon footprint. And this is what our customers expect from us. And this is what we, of course, in procurement expect from our suppliers as well in the entire supply chain. And this is why we are really focusing on those suppliers, and we have selection criteria for those to make the supply chain resilient, future-orientated, and as well prepared for sustainability expectations of our customers in the future.
Yes, we should turn to sustainability. Before we do, let me just tell you the results of our poll. We had, you'll remember, 5 sectors. The leading sector, according to our audience, will be e-commerce. 43% of people chose that. Renewable energy came second, pharmaceuticals and honourable third. Well, sustainability, it's come up a number of times already, and it's clearly a high priority for European businesses and becoming a higher priority for ASEAN businesses. Christian, I know that you've adopted it as one of the sort of chief criteria for selecting your suppliers, but how easy is it to find companies that can meet the demanding sustainability criteria that European business now expects?
Those suppliers are out there, and they're not so easy to find. We are in this pretty lucky situation that we had a pretty good supplier footprint before. And now we can reduce it to the best out of those. And as well, we do a lot of supplier scouting and supply chain intelligence that we identify upcoming players who are already investing into sustainability aspects in the future. And the discussions are sometimes quite difficult. And a lot of times then the suppliers say, oh, this will certainly increase the price of the product you buy from us. And then we say, no, our customers are expecting this from us, and they are not willing to pay a premium on this because they believe this will be the new normal. So this is the more challenging part with the suppliers, that this will be part of the new normal, the expectation on sustainability, carbon footprint reduction, reusability of their products, that this will be new criteria for many of the companies buying from Europe, from ASEAN suppliers, that they will request the sustainable footprint, while they are not willing to pay an additional premium on this. But I believe this can be combined, and I believe other customers of the same supplier will request for the same thing. And if the supplier now is willing to move into the direction, it will be a competitive advantage for those suppliers who are starting first, or really front runners in sustainability in the environment of ASEAN countries, where many other suppliers may be more hesitant to move into the future direction of sustainability.
Kai, can I ask you, how far have these concerns for sustainability filtered into the cutthroat financial industry? Christian mentioned the demands from his customers. Obviously, companies like Siemens are clients for banks. What are they telling the financial industry they need from you?
Yeah, I think in short, it's a catch-up for the banking industry. I think the banks were for a very long time on the sideline watching what our clients were doing. And I think what we did certainly is start listening to our clients. And Christian exactly articulated how a company looks at the importance of sustainability. So what Standard Chartered did by listening to our clients is developing a financing toolkit where the products for supply chain financing, for trade financing, mirror sustainability by applying standards which have been adopted across the industry by the NGOs, by governing body, and connecting the knowledge base which is out there and listening to the clients, listening to the expert, and bringing that into the financing toolkit. We believe we found the answer to service our clients. But truth be told, again, we are as an industry behind that, not talking about only Standard Chartered, but other banks catching up what our clients already are doing. But I see this certainly for us. We launched our sustainable trade finance proposition 2 months ago. Other banks doing the same, and I see our industry coming together on that. With the unique footprint we have in the ASEAN market, we are speaking to each and every country and evaluating solar projects, sustainable palm oil, project financing on the base of Equator principles, and bringing all of that together under the sustainable trade finance proposition. So I see this as a huge shift in mindset from the banks, which you saw probably really starting to take off since last year. So I'm very, very happy how the industry is reacting to it. Before it was a nice to have, a good to talk about, but it becomes an imperative with banks like Standard Chartered subscribing to net zero.
While we're on the topic of sustainability, I should ask our third polling question of the audience, because it's on this theme exactly. So if we could push that out to the audience, please. The question is a little bit provocative. European business cares more about sustainability than ASEAN business does. Agree or disagree? Those are your choices. I'll be interested to see the results. Kai, you mentioned that finance is beginning to catch up with the concerns for sustainability. How easy is it to incorporate those concerns into sort of high frequency transaction banking as opposed to project finance?
Yeah, another great question, Simon. I think that was almost for my business the holy grail. When you provide a financing, and I've mentioned project financing, a term loan, you have time to do your due diligence. Like Christian is evaluating the supplier in a lending relationship, you have time to evaluate your counterparty. But in the hamster wheel of trade finance, where clients like Siemens expect a 3 to 4 hour turnaround time on a transaction, how do you evaluate whether something comes from a sustainable source? And that is certainly what the team in Standard Chartered, the sustainability team and the trade team has done, adopting principles to avoid greenwashing and still being able to make a decision in real time in the hamster wheel of trade, coming to a conclusion because the due diligence has been done before. We know which type of clients we want to bank. Is it from a sustainable source or not? Does it go to a sustainable source? What is the underlying good? Is that sustainable or not? And these criteria we've put into a framework, and that enables us to use the hamster wheel of trade finance with more than 7 million transactions a year to be oiled and select the sustainable transaction and offer those to our clients as a particular sustainable financing tool.
Christian, I think you wanted to come in here.
Yes, I would like to build on what Kai just said. I would completely support the idea of having like a joint database, that we have a clear view as buying companies as well as you as banks, that we have the same understanding what is the criteria on code of conduct, on compliance, on avoiding child labor, on avoiding money laundering, on environmental health and safety protection. and as well on CO2 footprint, for example, like the science-based target initiatives, that we have the clear understanding it's open to everybody and that we can take the same evaluation on all those suppliers and come to the same results. And so now at the moment, everybody is having their own code of conduct, having their own expectation on how to measure carbon footprint. And it's not transparent. And I would really highly support this transparency in having joint criteria and joint open understanding of where the suppliers are, that we can evaluate and take decisions from this transparency jointly and quickly.
Isabel, have you had a similar experience with somewhat conflicting requirements?
Absolutely. I think I fully agree, even if we are in another industry, fully agree with all what was said. I think also thinking of the suppliers having maybe different standards, ask requirements from different customers. This must be very difficult for them. If we are coming in, we might ask for this and this, and somebody else has a slightly different ask, etc. So having standardization, harmonization on those requirements, having even if we are auditing, can we not sort of use sort of a framework of auditing to say, okay, these suppliers have been audited and are compliant to whatever we need. So absolutely, yes.
Well, I have the results from our polling question. Oh, Satvinder, I think you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just on sustainability in ASEAN. So for sure, sustainability is also here in ASEAN. Naturally, even as we were coming out with our framework for our recovery, sustainability as a value, this was a commitment that all of the ASEAN member states, the leaders, put to where any of the recovery initiatives that we are undertaking, we have to ensure that we do our best, that we also push sustainability initiatives across the region. So that's part and parcel now. I think if it was 5 years ago, it's just like digitalization. Today, digitalization is so core to everyone, any part of the world. And the COVID has just strengthened that. I think similarly, another area that has actually gained a lot of deep traction is actually sustainability. I think what's important, as what Kai has been mentioning, obviously there's a demand side from consumers, but I think definitely the finance side needs to come with it. There must be an incentive for the transition from normal businesses towards wanting to invest into sustainable practices and to become, so that they can clearly see that they're going to be more competitive and there's higher profits in getting there. So nobody's going to be more sustainable just for the sake of being sustainable. It has to come with some sort of a positive value outcome to businesses. And I think I've seen banks, I've seen financial institutions move in that area, but not enough. You're not seeing as much a differentiator factor in coming and encouraging SMEs to move in that direction. And I think clearly, if more of that comes, then more and more of businesses will be willing to come forward to make the change if they are able to derive good financing, competitive financing that will encourage them, to move in that direction. I think that's going to be core. So to me, that's something I want to sort of echo what Kai is saying. But I'm just saying that it's still very early stage. There's a lot of requirements for the SMEs to move in a sustainable way, but the resourcing that's available for them to move again across many of the developing countries is very weak, and neither does the financial sector support.
Well, let me share now the results of the poll. European business cares more about sustainability than ASEAN business. Well, 75% of our audience agree, 25% disagree. Those are suspiciously round numbers. It makes me wonder if only 4 audience members dared to vote on that controversial question. Anyway, I also wanted to ask the panel some questions that were submitted by the audience. A number of them deal with the new economy, with digital trade. One question is, how will global trade finance be transformed by digital technology? How fast do you see the change? Kai, that seems like a question for you.
Yeah, that's a multifaceted question, which I don't think I find the answer within the remaining time. Let me try to, for the non-trade finance practitioner here, try to take one step back to illustrate the problem here. We are a paper-based business still. So if you want to clear your cargo in Jakarta port, Vietnam port, you need an original bill of lading, a title document. And that's a physical printed document you need to present to clear your cargo. That is where trade finance is globally. We are a paper-based business. So a lot needs to happen to overcome that we use an electronic title. The paper I've mentioned, the electronic bill of lading, replacing the paper to clear your cargo, so that the port is enabled, the forwarder is enabled, the banks are enabled, importer, exporter are enabled. So the whole value chain of the supply chain needs to be digital. That's a Hercules task, and it requires a respective jurisdiction to enable the electronic title. So Abu Dhabi has done that, and Singapore has just done it. So this is when the industry talks about these digital islands. So yes, you can do it in Abu Dhabi, and you can do it in Singapore, which is great. And you can even form a closed circle between these two countries. But all the rest in ASEAN is not yet digital because of the title regime and with the underlying law. So two things needs to happen. The jurisdiction in the ASEAN country all need to adopt it. And then secondly, the technology needs to provide it to all participants in the supply chain. On the second part, I'm a lot more optimistic. Thanks to fintech, thanks to innovation that has moved so much faster than anyone would have expected. And there are a lot of platforms out there, e-commerce platforms, procurement platforms out there, financing platforms out there. Banks are teaming up to this. Banks are catching up to some extent. I'm not so worried on the technology part. The real concern is adoption in country. But it's a short answer to a very complex question.
Sadvinder, did you want to add anything? We don't have too much time, but if you would like to add a brief comment.
Yes, I want to thank you for raising that big problem. That was what exactly I wanted to say, that trade digitalization it's very important. I think trade documentation digitalization is the key. There's a lot of financial tightness, liquidity tightness in our markets, not just ASEAN, but rest of the world, simply because there's no transparency, not sufficient transparency, and therefore fraud happens. So definitely, once we move in that direction, it really will help everyone, the SMEs and even large companies. But I think the most important critical part where I see Europe, and especially at the G2G level, it's not about technology like what Kai said. It's really about the jurisdictions, the legal laws, recognizing digital documentation. That's what is needed in each of the ASEAN countries. And this is where I do hope the European Union does come forward in capacity building and supporting ASEAN to move in that journey. And like I said, there are very nice best practices already we are beginning to see in the region. It's a matter of helping the regimes adjust themselves. Yeah.
Well, that's perhaps a good note on which to end. Further scope for cooperation between the European Union and ASEAN, not just in terms of commerce, but also in terms of capacity building, sharing experiences and sharing lessons. I think one thing I've taken from this discussion is that as well as the importance of diversifying into ASEAN, the building of relationships with companies in the region seems to be very important. It's not enough just to have a lot of suppliers. You need to have a preferential, high priority relationship with your suppliers. That's a dimension of resilience that's sometimes neglected. Well, thanks again for all of you for joining us. Thanks to Standard Chartered for supporting this discussion. And I hope you enjoy the rest of Global Trade Week.